The journalism industry is at a crossroads. Revenues are declining, advertising is less, people are not buying print newspapers. Well, these things are causing the news industry to struggle, and the impact is to journalists. Folks are being laid off, buyouts are occurring. I recently had an interview with a journalist from the San Diego Union Tribune who took a buyout. So what that interview inspired me to do was try to use this platform to not just talk about the joyous and fun and funny things about a journalist's career, but maybe really help some folks. The Journalism Job Seeker series on Flack Talk is an opportunity for journalists who may be between jobs or freelancing but looking for a more stable opportunity to come on, talk about their careers, talk about what they've done, share some more information about their skills with the hopes that maybe a journalism organization or a communication organization is listening and sees them as a potential asset. So take a listen to this episode from our Journalism Job Seeker series here on Flack Talk.
Flack Talk with James Canning, the podcast with the inside scoop on journalists from San Diego and across the nation. If you're a communications pro, have a nose for news, or you're just nosy, this is the podcast for you. Now here's your host, James Canning.
Hey everybody, welcome back to Flack Talk. I'm really excited for today's show. We have our very first person who has anything to do with sports, who has reported on sports. It's really exciting for me to have Bill Shea. He's the former national sports business reporter with The Athletic. We knew each other from some time at Crain's Detroit Business, and we're going to get into a little bit of that. But Bill, hey, thanks for coming on the show.
Happy to be here.
Glad to have you, man. Glad to have you. So, folks, I got to tell you this how I got to know Bill. It was really because I fucked up on something. So what happened was Bill worked for Crain's Detroit Business. He did this unique beat that I was always reading and watching. He did sports, the business of sports, and he did media, the business of media, and he would report on these things. And so I was at this event that Crain's hosted, a house party, and he's like coming down an elevator or escalator, and I'm going up, and I see him, and I didn't really had ever talked to him. And at some point I went, Bill Shea, how you doing, man? And he looks at me with these cold, steely eyes and goes, Bill Shea, like the stadium, Shea Stadium. And I was like, oh shit, I fucked up. It's my intro to this guy, and I fucked up. And then I got the opportunity to live in this great neighborhood in Lafayette Park. And I come to find out that Bill is my neighbor. We were going to the pool one day, and I'm like, oh shit, Bill's my neighbor. Hey, Bill Shea. I got it right that time. And then afterwards, we were we did a little work together when he was still at Crain's doing the Movement Electronic Music Festival. Was one of my clients, and he was covering it and stuff like that. And so from afar, since I moved from Michigan, I've just been watching Bill, work with The Athletic, his work with Crain's at the time. And I thought it'd be fun to have him on and just talk. And I don't know. I think you have a very witty personality, Bill. So I'm looking forward to this conversation. So thanks for being here.
Yeah, it's my pleasure.
See, he's very kind of, it's my pleasure. But you're going to see, he's going to get all fired up and shit. All right. So Bill, we're going to get into this. I want to talk to you a little bit about, you grew up in Cleveland. We were talking off air that you, at one point in your life, there was a chance you almost would have been a San Diegan. So maybe you want to share a little bit about that, but also I want to hear about, was there something in your upbringing in the Midwest or Ohio that kind of inspired you to become a journalist?
Yeah, there was. First off, it was not long after I was born in the mid-'70s. My folks went out to San Diego, loved it, bought a house overlooking the Pacific, and not long after decided they missed Cleveland, Ohio, and came back. So I grew up in the Midwest instead of the Pacific Ocean, for which I have never forgiven my parents. And it also meant I grew up a Browns fan as well, which is just another layer of torture.
Oh man, we're gonna get into that. Browns, Lions, we're gonna talk about that definitely.
But and I grew up, I was in Cleveland, and later on through a lot of elementary school, Pittsburgh, and then suburban Cincinnati and Florida my senior year. But always a Clevelander at heart. You just get stuck with it. But I had an aunt Aunt Doreen, she was a long time newspaper reporter and editor at the Jacksonville newspaper, the Times-Union. Her husband was an executive, I think, like vice president of production. And she was fairly prominent. She was a bit of a pioneer. She was one of perhaps the first woman to be a Sunday editor of a whole newspaper. And she interviewed first ladies and stars. And to this day, she's 85 and long retired now. She still gets, letters and Christmas cards from celebrities and things like that.
That's
so,
cool.
that interested me. And I was also a huge fan of the old comic strip that it's still around, digital version called Bloom County, which was very funny, topical, political, cultural. And there was a mock newspaper within the storylines of that. And I just was in love with that sort of thing. So it was always in the back of my mind to get into journalism. I'm old enough where the old romantic notion of the reporter on deadline at the typewriter and the glass of whiskey and the cigarettes or cigar, that's the front page and those sort of old movies and things like that. All the President's Men appealed to me. I got to do the Stop the Presses once in my career, which was a cool thing. Yeah, it was when Mike Ilitch died. We got it first, and I was driving up I-75 to go home, and had to call my editor and literally say, it was a Friday or whatever the deadline day was for the weekly print edition, and said, "Stop the Presses. The owner of the Little Caesars Pizza and the Detroit Tigers and Red Wings is dead."
Oh my!
So that was I don't want to say cool, but the experience of doing that, like, I actually got to do it once, which was neat.
Well, you always see it in the movies and stuff. Somebody's like, "Stop the presses, we got to do this," and so like I understand that. There's a bit of nostalgia, probably something you wanted to do. I like that.
Yeah, so it was good. So, but yeah, and I went to school and did the college paper and all that, and just fell in love with the people and the accountability and holding people in power to account and all that sort of thing, and seeing your name in print. Although I haven't seen my name in actual paper print in a long time, was just always appealing to me, and I've mostly enjoyed it for 30 years.
Yeah. No, that sounds great. I mean, to your point, like there's a romantic kind of way in which you look at your career, and I think that's, I don't know, it's endearing. I look at it like that for myself, and I think it's I hope more people look at their careers, whatever those might be, like that, because it should be something you're really passionate about, and it definitely comes through as you talk about it. I mean, I think, when you look at your career, you've won awards, you've had a long career, we're going to talk about a bunch of different times in your career, but like, can you give our listeners a sense of like, because you pointed out like there's no, I haven't seen my name in print like the paper versus the online, maybe like the different roles that you've played in the newsroom over your careers, kind of a quick synopsis, and then, where at this point in your journey are you, best suited to help a news outlet out?
Yeah, I've done a lot of newsroom roles. I was never an intern. I went straight from school and got a job at a 6-day daily back in 95 or something like that. Yeah. It's been a long time. Just as a reporter, I think my first gig, I was covering county government in suburban Dayton, Ohio.
Okay.
Schools, and all the usual cops, crimes, all of that sort of thing for an afternoon daily, which I don't even think those are around anymore, where the newspaper shows up on people's porches in the late afternoon, evening, AMs and PMs, the lost art of newspapering. I've been a reporter for a long time. I was an editor for many years. I was a sports editor in Ohio for a while and enjoyed that. I was in my 20s and did editing, writing, design, headlines, the whole thing on T3 Mac. I remember late 90s. And
is that the one with like the back? Is that the one with the colored back? The T3 Mac?
Those were the iMacs. Those were what the reporters had. They had handles on top, yes. like just taking on a canoe trip or something. No, the G3s were like the big editor. They all for the page design and all that sort of thing. And I really I really liked a lot of that. I had basically just a small paper in Lancaster, Ohio, outside of Columbus. It basically got to do what I wanted. And it was just 3 or 4 of us in the sports department, a lot of high schools. We covered the Buckeyes and Browns and stuff like that too. But it's a good time. And I was a city editor at the newspaper in Port Huron, Michigan for 5 or 6 years. And I got to Michigan. I was recruited by Gannett back in 2000 and came up to Michigan. They offered me different landing spots, and I picked Port Huron.
Yeah.
And I don't remember why, but I did.
Yeah.
I know one of the alternatives was White Plains, New York. And in retrospect, it may have been the better choice. But I ended up at Port Huron. In 2000, it was still a salad days for newspapering, when profit margins were still in the 20s, which is just unheard of for most industries. But, and then things started to go downhill. Like when I got there, I was the night city editor initially.
Okay.
And I think we had 12 reporters on the city desk. That doesn't include sports or features, opinion, copy to any photographers, just 12 reporters reporting to a couple of city editors. And by the time I left in 2006, we were down to like 2 or 3. And I was sleeping in the newsroom, like in the couch out in the lobby, and using the emergency shower in the press room to brush my teeth and, clean up. And it got miserable.
Yeah.
And I left there and went to Crain's in downtown Detroit, and that was like coming up for air. And I spent 13 years there, mostly reporting, but did some editing, some project management, some of the awards coverage, like 40 under 40, 20 in their 20s. I did that for a couple of years.
Yeah.
Not my favorite thing, is a lot to that. But in my heart, I love writing, reporting and writing. That's sort of the core of who I am. But, I've taken pictures and stuff. But not my strength, and even at home, it's not my strength. It's a struggle to keep my finger off the lens or whatever.
I gotcha.
Yeah, so that's really been the gist of it.
Yeah, no, that's great. That's great. Are there like that those early days, like at the paper in Port Huron and Times Herald, if I remember correctly, that's the paper, right? I mean, like, were there and given like kind of the freewheeliness of the time and then maybe before the cuts, was there any interesting like war stories or interesting stories that like you had to cover you didn't believe you were covering or things like that? Because I think that today it's a much different pace, whereas then you had a little bit more time to really dig in.
There's been things over the years, and it's interesting and shocking and surprising to me how long I've been doing this. 30 years creeps up on you pretty quick. And there's so many times I look up stuff or Google stuff and I'm like, oh my God, I forgot about that story. There was like, it was a shootout once in Yellow Springs, Ohio. It was the first time as a reporter I ever heard bullets whistling past me. When I was one of the editors in Port Huron, we had and I'm not going to name names or details, but there was a reporter who had some issues and ended up stabbing somebody and trying to jump off the Blue Water Bridge to kill themselves. And it was, that was a huge mess for that person. And just like, there's no journalism school training for that sort of thing.
No.
And it was on what was called Boat Night. That was the big party night, the night before the Port Huron, the Chicago Mackinac sailboat race. And all the it's like 300 sailboats in town. Everybody's partying and drunk and boozy, and the newspaper was drunk and boozy downstairs. They turned the lobby into an open bar, basically.
Really?
But I'm working, and I heard this person's name come across the police scanner. I was like, oh shit! So I'm calling the top editor and the publisher, and like, what do we do?
Oh man!
I've never had that. Nobody's, so that was one. And thankfully everybody turned out okay. That person got the help that they needed. No one died or anything.
Oh, that's great.
But it's been, I've interviewed Trump. I've interviewed, Larry David, just all sorts of people. And you forget sometimes, like, oh yeah, I interviewed that guy, and LeBron, and after a while, there's just so many you lose track.
So so I got to ask this because I mean, like, you're dropping a couple names here. Like, what was Trump like? What was LeBron like? Like, tell me, and at what point in their life were you doing that?
But sports stuff, it's mostly just quick. I've only had a few run-ins or just interviews where it was actually memorable with the person. With LeBron, it's not a sit down or anything like that. Press conferences and scrums and stuff like that. Trump was about a half an hour or so phone call I had. It was before he was president. It was a year or two, I think, before he ran. And I asked him if he was going to run, and he promised up and down he would call me and tell me when he made the decision, which I knew at the time was bullshit. Was just about every other thing out of his mouth. I actually had drawn the short straw. No one had wanted to interview him at the time, and it sort of fell to me as the last person walking into whatever meeting or whatever it was. I'm like, okay, I guess I'll do that. But he was exactly like you see on television or social media. There's no. This is just my sense. There's no more depth to the man behind closed doors than there is in public. It's very two-dimensional. And Trump is a product of the gossip pages and that whole, it's sort of long lost New York sort of media market, right. The tabloids and things like it was, it was funny back in the day. It's a whole lot less funny now, but the only really memorable thing other than him bullshitting me a few times was he kept mispronouncing Dan Gilbert, his name, the Detroit billionaire that owns the Cavaliers and Quicken Loans. He kept calling him Dean Gilbert repeatedly, which would drive, I'm sure, Dan Gilbert nuts to have known. But Trump knew who he was. Dan Gilbert, even at the time, had more money than Donald Trump, and far more wealthier. It was. I wrote whatever I wrote at the time.
That's interesting.
You get to a point in your career where you've written so much, whether it's good, bad, or indifferent, that you just only a handful of things really stick out with you. Just because I think the human brain only has so much, RAM where I can remember, enough storage up there. Where I still occasionally Google something and one of my old stories comes up and I have no memory of like, oh man, this is pretty good. Who wrote this? Oh, I did. It's like, oh, and I don't mean that to sound egotistical or not. It was just, I surprised myself because I'm my own biggest critic of all. Is nobody bigger or with more self-doubt or imposter syndrome than me. But it's a nice experience when you discover something you long ago wrote and you don't hate it. Like,
yeah.
And then you don't have to credit yourself when you steal whatever fact you were looking for. You're like, oh, I don't have to credit anybody because I did this.
Right. That's great. Well, I think like, if our listeners can't tell, I mean, Bill is like, I think he's well read. He's a reader. He's a writer, and like I get this sense, like, and I don't really know this man, but like I kind of just based on my following you over the years and things like that. We've never talked about this, but like it feels like you love literature, like Ernest Hemingway. You love going to Key West. I was thinking like someone who writes like you do. It's probably important to be somebody who reads and someone who inspires them. Like, is that a thing for you? Like, I don't know, Hemingway your guy? And, I don't know, is my assessment right? Like, you're a voracious reader and, like, you got some writers that are just, they inspire you?
Yeah, I think that's true. In middle age, I've discovered I am more of a voracious book buyer than reader.
Okay.
Can't keep up as much anymore. I probably have 2,000 books in the house.
Wow.
But yeah, it's, and you brought up Key West. It's probably my favorite place on earth. It's, and not just Hemingway, but all of the writers and artists that have come through that island over the last 120 some years, Hemingway being the most famous, but there was a lot of others, poets, and like Elizabeth Bishop and Truman Capote, Tennessee Williams, whose home is not a museum, it's still a private residence down there. I mean, there's a vast literary and arts history to Key West that I think rivals, New York or Paris in terms of particularly the writers that have called it home there. A bunch of them in the 70s, like Jim Harrison and Thomas McGuane, who were both from Michigan originally, and so many others. There's, it's a tourist town, like any other beach town in America, but it's got this literary sheen, arts sheen, and it's very LGBTQ friendly as well, that it makes it very, very unique. And that appeals to what we were talking about, the writer / literary side of me, is probably stronger than the journalism side. Writing is writing. But the question is, which can you use to make a living? For me, it's been journalism for a long time. But people like Hemingway were journalists before they were novelists and short story writers.
Right.
But they do provide inspiration. Hunter Thompson, probably another Key West guy, probably one of the bigger ones. For me, and particularly his use of language, and that interests me, how you use language to evoke emotions and reactions in people. Thompson always referred to it as like music. When you're at the keyboard, it's like writing a song in some ways, particularly fiction and things like that. That's sort of always, that's my actually sole remaining bucket list life goal, is to finish a novel. It's never been journalism. Journalism has been a means to an end, and I enjoy it most times. But I think my obituary, I would rather have famous novelist than famous journalist to be the first thing listed. But I'll settle for average for both of those if that's how it shakes out.
Wait, have you written books, or are you are you in the process of writing books? That's something I didn't know.
I haven't published a book yet. I've been approached over the years about different things, but I had always wanted to write a novel, and that's a very sort of trite stereotype for reporters. But I had an idea. I had thought for decades and decades, what do I have to say? I don't want to write a novel until I have something to say. And it was only not that long, in the last 5 years, where sort of an idea crystallized in my head, and current events have helped that along. Events in the world, in the United States. So that may be sort of the near term thing that I do next in my career, is finally taking the time to finish that. And I've gone to some writer fiction workshops and things. Key West has an annual literary seminar that's extremely famous. Pulitzer, Nobel Prize winners, show up, and it's a different theme every year. And I've done that a few times and made some good friends and met some people and did journalism out of it. I did a long feature on Buzz Bissinger down in Key West a few years ago. He was attending the literary seminar as a speaker. It was sports and literature was the theme for the week. And Buzz wrote Friday Night Lights back in the 90s.
Oh, wow.
And he was a Pulitzer-winning reporter at the Philadelphia Inquirer before that. And Friday Night Lights obviously changed the trajectory of his very interesting life. And he was down there, and we got together, and I did a full story about him and sports and what's next for him. So I'm always looking for ways to write, whether it's journalism or fiction or something else, in whatever circumstances. And sometimes it aligns where I'm in my favorite place and getting to do my favorite thing, writing. And I hope that works out more in the future.
Yeah.
Key West has a lot nicer weather than Detroit does.
Well, you mentioned the sports stuff, and you talked about the interest in writing. I want a term. Frankly, I'll be honest, I had to look it up, but I've seen you use it. I've seen your writing about it, but like Gonzo Journalism. You mentioned it in your Twitter profile. It kind of, your email kind of invokes that, and you've written about Gonzo Journalism for The Athletic a couple years ago. For our listeners, can you describe what that is and why it really connects with you and maybe you enjoy it?
Yeah, let me take a step back and explain how I became familiar with that particular type of journalism. When I was in college, at our college newspaper, I walked in one day to the office, and on a desk was a review copy of a book sitting there, and it was called Hunter by E. Jean Carroll, who has been in the news a lot the last few years with her sexual assault case with the former president. And she had written an oral biography that was really kind of a funky setup in the way she did it, talking to Hunter, and she had spent time, I guess, out at his home in Colorado and all his boyhood friends and colleagues and things. And I had never heard of him. And I want to say this is 1993, early 94. So I read this book. There was a picture of Hunter on the front. He's holding, he's got a shotgun on his hip, and he's wearing his famous multicolored patch jacket and like camouflage pants. And I'm like, I think he's wearing a fedora or something. I'm like, who in the hell is this guy? And I started reading it and realized, oh, it's a journalist. And I had no idea, and I was 20 or whatever it was, that type of journalism could be done, which is Gonzo journalism. And there is no like agreed unified sort of textbook definition other than it is participatory, and there's nothing unique about participatory journalism, but it sort of takes exaggeration, extreme rhetoric to make a wider point as the journalist, in this case it was Hunter Thompson, participating in these various things he was covering. I mean, he's probably most famous for the novel Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, which appeals to young people because of the booze and the drugs, and they often overlook sort of the cultural statement Hunter was making about the death of the American dream and the sort of flaccid cheapness of Vegas in the 70s. And he used sporting events, sort of his first person observations and his wild rhetoric about things. Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas was born out of Sports Illustrated sending him to cover the Mint 400 off-road, like dune buggy motorcycle rally in the desert outside of Vegas. Whatever he wrote for them originally, they aggressively rejected. He ended up publishing in Rolling Stone, which is still a fairly new magazine. At the time, and it exploded from there. A couple of years prior to that, Hunter got assigned to write about the Kentucky Derby, and he was from Louisville, so it was very familiar to him. And they sent a Welsh artist named Ralph Steadman to accompany him. That's where they met, and he wrote this story called "The Kentucky Derby is Decadent and Depraved," which had almost nothing to do with the race. I think the winner is mentioned once, but it's about the culture of the event and the massive disparities in income and class and race and all. It's just the insanity. If you've ever been in the infield of Churchill Downs on Derby Day, it's which I have a couple of times. It's madness out there, and he wrote about that in ways that hadn't been done. Particularly, this was 1970, right? A very buttoned up sort of world. I mean, there's the hippies and the anti-war movement, all these things going on in America, but that wasn't reflected except in the underground press, which Rolling Stone was sort of on the verge of, and magazines like Scanlon's Monthly, which is what published the Kentucky Derby piece and was widely read by important people. And then Hunter went on to use Rolling Stone sort of as a platform. He covered the 1972 presidential campaign, and he wrote a lot about his participation as a journalist covering that campaign and in his observations of candidates and his tendency to bet on who's going to win this primary and odds and it's just wild stuff you would never catch in the pages of the New York Times or Time magazine at the time. Right. It was very intense, hardcore, opinionated rhetoric. He had a point of view. It was point of view journalism, participatory. Yeah. A lot of language and just, it wasn't mainstream, and it resonated with people. And he went on to do it with the Super Bowl and other things. And I've never really done it myself because I've never worked for outlets that will let you call somebody a bloody iguana or just whatever the terminology may be. and and a lot of young journalists, usually men, go through a phase of trying to imitate Hunter and producing just absolutely wretched writing. He was the master of that, and I'm of the firm belief that his style of Gonzo should be, started and ended with him. Now, the wider term of using Gonzo's exaggeration to tell a larger point, that didn't originate with him. Jonathan Swift had done things like that. Twain. When you're trying to get to a larger truth, where maybe just straight narrative doesn't get you there, or not to such an audience. It's best left in the hands of master craftsmen. But I think it's extremely funny and interesting and original. George Plimpton famously, did first person sports journalism with the Detroit Lions and Paper Lion. And, he played with the Celtics and the Bruins, and I think the New York Philharmonic, all these sort of things. Those are really interesting to me. And I did a piece on Hunter and participatory journalism, I think back in 2020, because it's going to be the 50th anniversary of the Kentucky Derby as decadent and depraved. So that's sort of the roundabout way of what that is and why it appealed to me and still does to this day.
No, that's really cool, man. Like that's everything you said, man, it's like smart. Like, we're getting smarter here on Flack Talk, folks. I mean, though it is, I read a little bit, I saw it on your profile, I read a little bit, but like, great explanation. Thank you for taking us through that. Cause I think we all, especially in today's world, like, it's, you want to be a part of things, right? Everyone's trying to be a part of the video game, the this, that, whatever. But journalism really, particularly Hunter, as you pointed out, provides these opportunities. You let your imagination kind of figure it out. So I really appreciate that. You talked about sports a couple times in there. I got about 3 other questions about sports before we hit our breaking news round. But I want to talk a little bit about this idea of, for folks who don't know, like, we see people cover sports, you cover the game, but like, talk to us a little bit about the business of sports. Crain's, The Athletic, you've done this. What is that beat all about?
Well, it's really whoever the reporter or the publication is, what they want it to be. For me, I've always envisioned it as, number one, the most obvious stuff, the business side of it, contracts, money, taxes, financial policy, stadium and arena construction and public subsidies for that things. But it's beyond that to me as well, as social justice and politics and, social and cultural things around, off the playing field, and sometimes on the playing field, Colin Kaepernick kneeling, things like that.
Right.
Sports as a whole, if you look at it holistically, a reflection of global and American society in this country. When interest rates goes up, that affects sports as well. It's the pocketbook side of things. One of the things I really liked about was, covering, there was a thing called the Fan Cost Index put out for the last 30 some years by a group in Chicago that calculates what does it cost to take a group of 4 people, family or friends or whatever, to a game in any of the major leagues. And every year I would crunch the numbers and, write about, like, this is what it costs you to go to a Lions game or a Blackhawks game or a Chargers game or, something like that. Things that actually matter to people, and the social side of things and the racial side of things. One of the stories that I was most proud of was a few years ago, I think it was 2020 or 21. I did a piece looking at, there's I don't know if this is still the number, about 150 professional major league teams in the United States across the leagues. And there was one black owner, like majority or controlling owner. That was Michael Jordan, who just sold his stake in his basketball team. And why that is important and what has traditionally kept people out, African-American ownership out. It's 400 some years of American history in play, and the obstacles to the generational wealth required to have so much money to buy like an NFL team. The Washington Commanders just sold for $6 billion,
Right.
which is just nuts to me. Things like that, and they affect what happens on the court or the ice or the field as well. The financials, the legal, the political, everything comes into play. And a lot of people dislike that. They want to say, hey, games and sports are my escape. Oh, that may be true for that person, but it's not true for the people performing for you, the athletes, whether, kids or amateurs, college, professional. What they go through reflects our society. When Colin Kaepernick was kneeling, that was, there were reasons, and, the then president said what he said. Just all of that stuff affects sports. And I wrote a lot too about media, and particularly the last few years, I focused on viewership, and the way television has changed radically in the last decade, especially recent years with streaming, and what that has meant for sports, and the collapse of the regional sports networks. San Diego's been affected. Every town is with major league teams is affected.
Oh, totally.
By that.
Yeah.
And it's important to people. They may not think about it, and we're a month away from college football season starting. The University of Michigan's first game is on Peacock. It's not on broadcast television or cable.
Right.
And there's going to be a whole lot of people that discover that first game. They're going to be flipping around, complaining, being like, "Where is it?" Well, the sports biz people told you months ago where it was going to be at, and why. I do sort of today miss covering that stuff, because it turned out to be really interesting to me, how Nielsen works and how that's all changed. I wrote a big piece on how the NFL became the television powerhouse that it is. It's got something like $120 billion in long-term television and streaming deals. And
wow.
I wrote extensively on Thursday Night Football. NFL games got put behind the Amazon Prime paywall last year.
Totally.
And there was two different groups of viewerships reported after every game, and I explained why that was. All of this, people don't think it matters or annoyed by it, but it very much matters to sports and sports fans, whether they realize it or not.
Yeah. No, that's fascinating. I mean, it's always fascinated me in reading your writing on these things. I mean, it's that inside baseball, to use a sports reference, right, of like the business. And I think that's, more and more, we gravitate. I mean, look, the NFL does an amazing job of keeping you interested all year long. Whereas like baseball, in my opinion, like just they haven't kept that connection to people. And it just, I don't know, it makes people not be interested as much anymore.
You're right. When you look at, median ages for fan bases, the PGA Tour is amongst the oldest, and they're fine with that because their advertisers, are Rolex and Rolls,
right,
appealing to that age demographic that has that sort of money. Baseball, I don't remember what the most recent number was, but it's like mid or upper 50s.
Wow.
Advertisers mostly are not interested in advertising to people in that age cohort, because it's the 18 to 49 demo that I'm very near exiting. It's because that's traditionally when people have made their brand decisions. Like I like Chevy or Levi's or Visa or State Farm,
Right.
That's who they're trying to get is, and one of the things I learned in covering business is, it's like, oh, why is brand X advertising during a Women's World Cup game or an NBA game or whatever it may be? It's because, they have the demographic data of who they're trying to reach and turn into fans.
Yep.
Just, or clients or customers just through name recognition. Like you're like, oh, I don't care about this insurance. Well, when it comes time to like change insurance or sign up, you're like, what names come to mind? Like we can do a Google search, but you're going to see Progressive and State Farm and Geico. And we know that because they spend tons of money on sports advertising. So it's all fascinating.
Yeah, no, it really is. It really is. Well, I want to pivot here before we hit the breaking news round into maybe not the business side of it, but more the fandom side of it for you. I know you got to be objective in all of your reporting and stuff, but like You're a huge Cleveland Browns fan. You know, I'm curious, one, if you have any predictions for the upcoming season, and now that kind of Deshaun Watson got the chance to kind of get the rust off last year. And then the fact that you live in Detroit, you know, my hometown, it's where we met, you know, and you see the Lions, and you hear all the excitement and where we could go, and the new Dan Campbell, Brad Holmes, you know, regime. So, you know, what's your take on them too? So Browns and then Lions, like, what's your thoughts?
Oh man, a Cleveland guy who lives in Detroit, man, an NFL fan. Talk about the frying pan or the fire. I'm not sure which is which. You know, the as we're recording this, you know, the Browns play tonight in the Hall of Fame game, and I remembered that this morning, and I was saying, shit, here we go again. You know, my first memory of the Browns and was January 1980. They were in a playoff game that they famously lost on a last-second interception. You know, one of those games where it's 5,000 degrees below zero, and Cleveland Municipal Stadium is just frozen green ice and just awful. And we were watching at home, and it was the first time I ever heard, I think it was my big brother, drop a F-bomb or shit or something at the end when Brian Sipe threw the infamous interception to end their season. And it's been kind of downhill from there, being a Browns fan. You know, I suffered through the 80s when they were good and lost all those heartbreakers to Denver in the AFC title games. And then they left in the 90s and came back, and it's just been dog shit for the most part. And when they're not losing, they're doing embarrassing things. Like, you know, I am, not to be polite, a fan of what they did to sign Deshaun Watson. I thought that was a mistake. You know, he may be an all-world talent. We'll see if that continues. I mean, he played a little bit last year, but the guy hadn't played in like 2 years, so I discount that. You know, it seems like they're in better shape on paper, but you know, I've seen them win 4 or 5 playoff games in my life. But including a couple years ago with Baker Mayfield, they went and beat Pittsburgh, and they almost beat Mahomes and the Chiefs in the next game. They made him work for it. It's frustrating. I'll watch. I'm not buying the NFL Sunday ticket like I used to 20 some years ago to watch them, because you know it's like $500 or whatever now, and I'm not paying that to go be disappointed every week. So I have no idea what that team will do this season. I see the moves, you know, I still casually pay attention to their off-season stuff, and I'm like, I'm clueless on what this team will do. It's one giant question mark for me. And as for the Detroit Lions, I just saw, you know, they've sold out their season tickets for this season. It's the first time since Ford Field opened in 2002. There's a waiting list now, and people are buying into the hype. You know, it's kind of like the Browns. It's the Lions. Yeah. They still have a lot to prove. I think Dan Campbell has certainly infused excitement into that team, and I think the attitude that is required, you know, with players, with management, ownership, fans, everything. I think that's the guy you want to get them out of the doldrums or worse. Now, whether that translates into sustained success on the field, we'll see. You know, they had an all-world quarterback in Matthew Stafford, who I liked. Just one of the most physically gifted. He holds just about every passing record for that team. Goff, you know, he's at times pretty good. You know, he's to me a solid B. You know, I know people bitch about Stafford here in Detroit, but he went right out to the Rams and won a Super Bowl. Right. And good for him. The talent is never a question. It's the problem with the Lions when Stafford's time in Detroit wasn't Matthew Stafford. It was everything around him and the special teams and, you know, Matt Patricia and his nonsense. And, you know, they've, you know, and I think under the current controlling owner, Sheila Hamp Ford, they're making better decisions. Maybe we'll see. And it's another one. You know, they could come out, win that division, win a playoff game for the first time since, was it 1992 or 94?
Yeah, something like that.
It was a lot. I think I was in high school the last time they did that, or maybe college. And now I'm an old man. So yeah, but they could also come out and go like 6-11, and I wouldn't be especially shocked. And all the caveats, injuries. You don't know until they play and what happens. I don't know how much depth that team has. They certainly have some talented, exciting players, and I'm interested to see how they do. I'm not a Lions fan, but
Right.
I wrote about them for a long time. I was in the press box for games, and I would tweet along and write about the interesting biz and the game day presentation side and funny stuff.
Yeah.
So I enjoyed it. The people of Detroit deserve to see that team finally win. And what I call the Book of Revelations Bowl will be the Browns and the Lions of Super Bowl. Somebody has to win. I mean, technically they could go into overtime that goes forever.
Yeah.
And no one ever wins, and they play to the heat death of the earth. But I think that would be, I don't know how many people would watch that, because it would be the most Midwest Rust Belt Super Bowl of all time. Two cities that are 3 hours apart. I hope it happens.
Yeah, I think that would be
day.
amazing. I think it would.
And if
be.
it does, I hope the Browns win.
Oh, come on now. No.
They used to meet in the 50s all the time.
Yeah.
They both beat each other for the NFL championships. Detroit's last in 1957 was them just stomping on the Browns. It was 55-10 or something like that.
Yeah.
But the Browns won several titles too and put a hurt on the Lions. They weren't leather helmets, but they weren't real far from the leather helmets back when that happened. And it's interesting. The Browns are going to wear white helmets this season for the first time since the 40s and early 50s. Back when they did, in the Otto Graham, Marion Motley, days way back. So I'm interested to see those. And the Lions have those new blue helmets, throwback or whatever they are.
I don't like it.
See, I do, because it's different. And a bunch of teams are wearing alternative helmets. I think the Titans are wearing a Houston Oilers helmet, which is a little weird.
Yeah, that is a little weird.
But I think Seattle and Tampa are wearing their expansion year uniforms and helmets, which I like that. I love the old Patriots, old 80s, 70s.
Yeah.
I wish they'd go back to that full time. I'm a sucker for nostalgia and stuff. I'm a full Gen X kid, 70s and 80s. So that stuff appeals to me. But yeah, Browns and Lions, this sounds like a cop out, but man, it's based on their history, their moves. I just don't know. I don't think either of them are going to win a Super Bowl this year, but God bless them if they do. And if the Browns do, I don't know.
You might mortgage everything you got to go see that one, right? Or will tickets be cheap? Or will we?
It's the Deshaun Watson thing that has me part of me feels dirty about cheering for that team. It's one of the things off the field sort of things that they have done. Plus they mortgaged the future, 3 first-round draft picks and all that. That is an enormous risk. And if it doesn't pay off, I mean, Jesus Christ, what are you left with?
Yeah. Well, we're going to see. We're going to see.
Yeah, very soon.
Well, Bill, thank you for that assessment. I really appreciate this. And this has been awesome. I think you made us smarter here on Flack Talk in a lot of ways. I want to get into what I call the breaking news rounds. Breaking news. These are questions I ask. They can be quick answers, but they're just to kind of get. I think we've learned a lot about you, but to even get just a little bit, even another layer down a little bit. Okay. Mm-hmm. So let's get into it. So, what is your favorite word?
Sometimes it's yes, sometimes it's no, and it all depends on the context. But in my life and career, those 2 words have led to some really good things. Okay. And then what's your least favorite word? Weirdly enough, I dislike the word beverage. I just think it's dumb. There may be words that I hate more, but that's always the first one that comes to mind. It's just, I don't know. Ever since I've been a kid, I've disliked the word beverage. It's a drink. Yeah. It's booze. It's whatever. Just, right. Beverage. What turns you on creatively, spiritually, or emotionally? As a writer, it's the music when you're at the keyboard and it's just flowing, or I'm reading something that is just brilliant and makes me incredibly jealous that I didn't do it. That really gets me pumped up to get to the keyboard.
I got you. And is there something that turns you off?
Recreational ignorance.
What does that mean? Explain a little bit.
People that opt to be either genuinely or performatively ignorant about something. And we have seen a lot of that over the past 6 years or so at all levels of society, I think, in the United States and elsewhere.
Yeah.
There's sort of a dumbing down in the rhetoric and logic, just performing logical functions and discussions on television amongst politicians. And it is deeply disturbing and often angering to me.
Got it. Well, do you got a favorite curse word when you get angry?
There's two. Motherfucker has always been my favorite, but the second choice is dipshit, because there's a level of scorn to that word. And I believe it was the New Yorker 4 or 5 years ago did a whole essay on the word dipshit. So I'm not alone. And that it's just sort of I think you're an idiot and I dislike you and don't respect you. That's what I take from dipshit.
Oh, that's interesting. I might have to find that story and put it in the show notes. That's good. Is there a noise or a sound that you love?
When my cat is sleeping and I get up close and hear her lightly snoring, is extremely relaxing to me. Also, the noise of the word yes being articulated when it's something I really want or need.
Okay.
Those two are pretty close.
All right. What about noise you dislike or hate?
Geez, that's a hard one. Sometimes the word no. But finger. I know this is a trite, but the fingers on the blackboard thing,
yeah.
Or there are several equivalents to that. Just I cringe. My hands are clenching just thinking about it.
Yep. I get it
now.
I get it.
That's a big one.
What about profession? Is there something other than the one you've chosen for yourself as a journalist that you'd like to attempt?
You know what? Film. I went to college initially to go to film school, and needed money, so I went into journalism instead while in college. And I wish I had stuck. 30 years later, in retrospect, I wish I had stuck with that, particularly since the film school at my alma mater is now the Tom Hanks Film School, and he hires everyone out of Wright State University to work on his productions.
That would have been cool.
And my son, who's about to be a senior in high school, wants to go to film school, so I am very pleased that one of us will have done it.
Yeah, live vicariously through him. That'd be awesome. Is there a profession that you've just heard about or seen that you just go, I couldn't do that, or you wouldn't like to do?
Politician.
Okay.
That's definitely one. Or anything where you're very high up in the air or very far under the ground of the ocean. I don't want to be a submariner or submersible driver or tunnel miner or a pilot, paratrooper. Nope, those are not things that I would want to do.
I got you. If for a final breaking news question, if heaven exists, what would you like to hear God say when you arrive at the pearly gates?
My first blush at this is to ask why he or she or they allowed coleslaw to be invented, because it's horrible. But in more seriousness, there was several public figures have done this, but I would want an explanation of why the horrible things in the world that occur are allowed to occur if the sort of infrastructure of religion as we know it is correct. It comes down to the famous problem of evil, the paradox of that. I would like an explanation of how that can be. That's a fairly deep theological.
No, that's one of the best ones I've heard so far. I mean, most people are like,
question.
Tell me I did good in my life, which isn't a bad thing, but I like that. That's a really interesting one.
Yeah.
Bill, this has been fantastic. I've really enjoyed this. Again, I think we're smarter now because is there, just like you would ask me if I was working with a client and you were interviewing them or whatever, or you'd ask them, is there anything else, final thought you'd like to share with our Flack Talk listeners?
Just be discerning with what you read and hear in the news and news media. Read basically and read from trusted sources. Don't believe the shitheads that are trying to grift you, and just be open and follow me on Twitter at Bill Shea _19 or whatever it's called, X or whatever it's called now. And if anybody's hiring, please send them my way.
Sounds good. Well, Bill, hey, thank you very much for joining us on Flack Talk. It was great to have you.
Well, thank you for having me, and I enjoyed it. So thanks again.
If you liked Flack Talk and want to learn more about your favorite muckrakers and newsbreakers, please hit the subscribe button or visit flacktalk.com. New Flack Talk episodes with James Canning air every other Tuesday, wherever you get your podcasts.